The Arizona Territory sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Copper Creek, a mining town that had sprung up like a desert flower after the recent silver discoveries. Sarah McLean stood in front of the cracked mirror in her family's modest adobe home, smoothing the wrinkles from her mother's old cotton dress, the only decent garment she owned. "It'll have to do," she whispered to herself, her fingers tracing the careful mends her mother had made years before consumption. Took her. The dress was a faded blue, once beautiful, but now showing its age with slightly frayed edges and fabric worn thin from countless WSHINGs. Her father, Patrick McLean, lay on his narrow bed in the corner, his left leg propped up and wrapped in bandages. A cave-in at the Silver Star mine 3 months ago had crushed his leg, leaving him unable to work, and the family depended on Sarah's meager earnings from taking in washing and mending for the town's more prosperous residents. "You look beautiful, my dear," Patrick said softly, his Irish accent still thick after 20 years in America. "Your mother would be so proud." Sarah forced a smile, though her stomach churned with anxiety. Tomorrow was her wedding day, and she knew the dress would draw whispers and stares from the town's elite. Mrs. Pemberton, the bank president's wife, had already made snide comments about proper wedding attire when Sarah had mentioned her upcoming marriage to Thomas Brennan. The town's skilled blacksmith. Thomas was a good man, honest, hardworking, and kind. He'd courted Sarah for over a year, never once mentioning her family's reduced circumstances or seeming to care about her lack of fine things. But Sarah knew that others in town would notice. They always did. "The Pembertons will be there," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And Mrs. Whitmore from the general store. They'll all be wearing their finest silk dresses imported from San Francisco." "Let them," Patrick replied with fierce pride. "You're worth 10 of them, Sarah girl. Thomas knows it, and anyone with sense knows it too." Sarah nodded, trying to draw strength from her father's words. The afternoon sun slanted through their small window, illuminating the sparse but clean room. Their furniture was simple: a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and the beds. But everything was meticulously maintained, scrubbed clean despite their POVERTY. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Thomas stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his dark hair damp from washing after a day at the forge. His hands, permanently stained from years of working with hot metal, held a small bouquet of desert wildflowers. "These reminded me of you," he said simply, offering the flowers with a shy smile. "Hardy and beautiful." Sarah's heart swelled. This was why she loved him, not just for his strength and reliability, but for moments like these when he saw beauty, where others saw only hardship. "They're perfect," she said, breathing in their sweet fragrance. "Just like everything else about tomorrow will be." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had been building. All week, she'd seen the way the town's women looked at her, heard their whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. Tomorrow would be the most public moment of her life, and she would be standing before them all in a dress that marked her as clearly as if she wore a sign proclaiming her poverty. That evening, as the desert sky painted itself in brilliant oranges and purples, Sarah sat by the window, carefully pressing her mother's dress one final time. The iron was heated on their small wood stove, and she worked with practiced efficiency, determined that even if the dress was simple, it would be impeccably presented. "Tomorrow changes everything," she told herself, trying to focus on the future. She and Thomas would build together, rather than the judgment she would face at the altar. Outside, the sounds of Copper Creek settling into evening filled the air, the lowing of cattle being driven to pasture, the distant laughter from the saloon, and the rhythmic hammering from Thomas's forge as he finished his work for the day. It was a hard life in this desert territory, but it was their life, and Sarah was determined to face whatever tomorrow brought with dignity and tact. The small wooden church at the end of Main Street was packed beyond capacity for Sarah and Thomas's wedding. Every bench was filled, and men stood along the walls, their Sunday best a sharp contrast to their usual work clothes. The morning sun streamed through the simple glass windows, casting patterns of light across the rough-hewn floor. Sarah stood in the tiny vestibule, her hands trembling as she held the wildflower bouquet Thomas had given her the day before. The blue cotton dress felt suddenly inadequate under the weight of so many expectant gazes. Through the doorway, she could see the assembled crowd miners and their families, shopkeepers, ranchers, and prominently in the front row, the town's social elite. Mrs. Pemberton sat rigidly upright, her emerald green silk dress and matching hat with ostrich feathers marking her unmistakably as the bank president's wife. Next to her, Mrs. Whitmore wore a burgundy taffeta gown that rustled with every small movement. Their jewelry caught the morning light, pearls, gold chains, and rings that probably cost more than Sarah's family had seen in years. "Ready, my dear?" asked Reverend Matthews, the circuit preacher who visited Copper Creek once a month. His kind eyes crinkled with warmth, but Sarah could see the concern there too. He'd witnessed enough frontier weddings to recognize the social dynamics at play. Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. She stepped through the doorway and immediately felt the weight of every eye in the church. The organ, a battered upright piano that Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house played for special occasions, began the simple wedding march. As Sarah walked down the aisle, she heard the whispers begin. "Look at that dress," came a voice that Sarah recognized as Mrs. Pemberton's daughter, Elizabeth. "It looks like something a servant would wear." "She," came another voice, but the damage was done. "Poor Thomas," whispered someone else. "He deserves better than a bride who can't even dress properly for her own wedding." Sarah's cheeks burned with shame, but she forced herself to keep walking, focusing on Thomas's face at the front of the church. He stood tall and proud, his eyes fixed on her with such love and admiration that for a moment the whispers faded. But as she drew closer to the front, the comments grew bolder. "That dress has seen better days," Mrs. Whitmore said, not bothering to lower her voice. Surely she could have found something more appropriate. "It's practically threadbare," added Mrs. Pemberton, with a laugh that carried clearly through the alley. "Small church. I wouldn't use that fabric for cleaning rags." The laughter that followed was like a physical blow. Sarah stumbled slightly, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. The entire congregation had heard. Even those who hadn't been whispering before were now looking at her dress with critical eyes, noticing every mend, every sign of age and wear. Thomas's jaw tightened with anger, and he took a step forward as if to intervene, but Sarah caught his eye and shook her head almost imperceptibly. She wouldn't have their wedding day remembered for a confrontation. "She's making a spectacle of herself," Elizabeth Pemberton said, loudly enough for half the church to hear. "How embarrassing for poor Thomas." At that moment, Sarah's composure nearly cracked completely. Her father, sitting in the front row with his injured leg propped on a wooden crate, started to rise with fury in his eyes, but the effort caused him to wince in pain. The sight of her father's helpless anger and physical suffering, combined with her own humiliation, was almost more than Sarah could bear. She reached Thomas's side, her face burning with shame, tears threatening to spill over despite her best efforts. The man she loved took her hands in his, and she could feel the anger radiating from him like heat from his forge. "You look beautiful," he whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet church. "Don't let them steal this moment from you, Ev." Reverend Matthews began the ceremony, his voice firm and carrying, but Sarah barely heard the words. The whispers had stopped, but she could feel the judgmental stares like physical weight. Her mother's dress, which had seemed so precious that morning, now felt like a costume marking her as an outsider in her own community. As the Reverend spoke about love and commitment, Sarah tried to focus on the words, on the meaning of what she and Thomas were promising each other. But the earlier humiliation echoed in her mind, and she wondered if this was how the rest of her life would be, always marked as less than, always judged for what she lacked rather than valued for who she was. The moment that should have been. The happiest of her life was tainted by cruelty and social prejudice, and Sarah felt something inside her break a little. She'd known there would be challenges in frontier life, but she hadn't expected such deliberate meanness from people who called themselves neighbors. In the back of the church, unnoticed by most of the congregation, a tall man in a simple brown suit watched the proceedings with growing displeasure. His weather-beaten hands gripped his hat tightly, and his gray eyes hardened as he witnessed the public humiliation of a young woman whose only crime was poverty. The ceremony continued despite the earlier humiliation, with Reverend Matthews's voice growing stronger and more protective as he spoke about the sacred nature of marriage and the importance of treating all God's children with dignity and respect. His pointed glances toward the front row made his disapproval of the earlier behavior clear. Do you, Thomas Brennan, take Sarah McLean to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in riches and in poverty, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Thomas said firmly, his voice carrying clearly through the church. He squeezed Sarah's hands, and she could see the fierce protectiveness in his eyes. And do you, Sarah McLean, take Thomas Brennan to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in riches and in poverty, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, but her resolve clear as Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife. The congregation began to shift restlessly, eager to move on to the reception in the church's side room where Sarah had spent days preparing simple refreshments with help from the few neighbors who had remained kind. But before anyone could rise, the tall stranger in the brown suit stepped forward from the back of the church. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with silver threading through his dark hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, though his clothes were simple and dusty from travel. Pardon me, Reverend, he said, his voice cultured but warm, with traces of an Eastern accent. Before we proceed to the celebration, I believe there's been an oversight. The congregation turned in surprise. No one recognized the man, though several of the older miners studied his face with growing recognition. I couldn't help but notice that the bride seemed to have had some difficulty with her wedding attire. The stranger continued, his gray eyes sweeping over Mrs. Pemberton and her circle with unmistakable disapproval. Where I come from, it's considered good fortune for a bride to receive a gift from a wedding guest, particularly when that guest has been moved by the obvious love and devotion displayed here today. He stepped toward the altar, pulling a wrapped package from a leather satchel he carried. The package was larger than anything that should have fit in the bag, and the wrapping was of fine paper tied with silk ribbon. Sir, that's very kind, but not necessary, Sarah began, but the stranger held up a gentle hand. Please, my dear. In my travels, I've learned that kindness given freely is kindness that returns threefold. He handed her the package with a slight bow. Perhaps you might step into the vestibule to see if this suits you better. Sarah looked uncertainly at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. With shaking hands, she untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the paper. Inside was the most beautiful dress she had ever seen, cream-colored silk with intricate beadwork that caught the light like tiny stars. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, and when she lifted it, she gasped to see that what she had taken for beadwork were actually small diamonds sewn into elegant patterns across the bodice and skirt. The church fell completely silent. Even Mrs. Pemberton's mouth hung open in shock. I can't possibly accept this, Sarah stammered. It must be worth ... It's worth exactly what it was intended for, the stranger said gently. Making a bride feel beautiful on her wedding day. The dress belonged to my late daughter. She would have been about your age, and I believe she would have wanted another young woman to feel the joy she never had the chance to experience. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but these were different tears of overwhelming gratitude and wonder. But sir, I don't even know your name. James, he said simply. James Morrison. And I insist you call me Jim. He gestured toward the vestibule. Mrs. Henderson, would you be so kind as to assist Mrs. Brennan? Mrs. Henderson, the boarding-house proprietor, stepped forward eagerly, her eyes bright with excitement and approval. Of course, come along, dear. As Sarah disappeared into the vestibule with Mrs. Henderson, the congregation buzzed with whispered speculation. Who was this James Morrison? How could he afford such an obviously expensive dress? And why was he being so generous to a stranger? Thomas approached the man, extending his hand. Sir, I don't know how to thank you. My wife, she's been dreading this day because of... He glanced toward the front row where Mrs. Pemberton sat in stunned silence. Because of small-minded people who mistake wealth for worth, Jim finished. Quietly. I've seen enough of the world to know the difference, son. Your bride has more dignity in her little finger than some folks have in their entire bodies. 10 minutes later, Sarah emerged from the vestibule transformed. The silk dress fit as if it had been made for her, the diamond accents catching the sunlight streaming through the windows and casting tiny rainbows around the church. Her dark hair, which she had arranged simply that morning, now seemed to frame. Her face perfectly against the elegant neckline. The change was breathtaking. Sarah looked like a princess from a fairy tale, but more than that, she looked radiant with confidence and joy. The shame and humiliation from earlier had been replaced by a glowing happiness that seemed to light up the entire church. The congregation stared in amazement. Even those who had been unkind earlier couldn't help but admire the transformation. Mrs. Pemberton looked particularly uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that her earlier comments now reflected poorly on her own character, rather than on Sarah's circumstances. Beautiful, Thomas breathed, taking his wife's hand and bringing it to his lips. Absolutely beautiful. Now, said Jim Morrison with satisfaction, I believe there's a celebration to be had. As the congregation filed out toward the reception, several people approached Jim with curiosity and gratitude, but he deflected their questions with good humor and humility. Only Patrick McLean, Sarah's father, managed to corner him briefly. Why? Patrick asked simply, his Irish accent thick with emotion. Why would you do such a kindness for strangers? Jim's eyes grew distant for a moment. Because someone should have done the same for my daughter when she needed it most, he said quietly. And because your Sarah reminds me that goodness and grace have nothing to do with the size of one's bank account. The wedding reception in the church's side room was transformed by the dramatic turn of events. What had begun as a potentially subdued affair, with many guests focused more on gossip than celebration, had become a joyous gathering centered around the remarkable generosity of the mysterious stranger. Sarah moved through the crowd like a different person entirely. The diamond-adorned dress not only made her look like royalty, but more importantly, it had restored her confidence and dignity. She stood tall, smiled genuinely, and accepted congratulations with grace, no longer the object of whispered mockery, but of admiration and curiosity. Mrs. Pemberton and her circle had grown notably quiet, clearly uncomfortable with how their earlier behavior now appeared in light of the dramatic reversal. Several of the women who had been quick to judge now approached Sarah with forced smiles and compliments about her lovely dress, though their discomfort was obvious. Thomas stayed close to his bride, his pride evident as he introduced her to the few guests she hadn't met. But both he and Sarah kept glancing toward Jim Morrison, who sat quietly in a corner, declining offers of food and drink, while watching the celebration with quiet satisfaction. It was old Pete McNamara, the grizzled prospector who'd been mining these hills since before the town existed, who finally approached Jim with recognition dawning in his eyes. "I thought I knew that face," Pete said, extending a weathered hand. "You're Jim Morrison of Morrison Railroad and Mining, ain't you? Built half the rail lines between here and Colorado." A murmur of recognition rippled through the nearby guests. Morrison Railroad and Mining was one of the largest companies in the territory, responsible for the rail spur that had brought prosperity to Copper Creek and dozens of other towns. Jim nodded reluctantly. "I am, though I was hoping to enjoy your town's hospitality without the fuss that usually comes with that information." "What brings you to Copper Creek, sir?" asked Bill Pemberton, the bank president, suddenly much more interested in the stranger than he had been earlier. "I'm considering expanding the rail line further south," Jim replied. "I like to visit communities personally before making such investments. See what kind of people live there, how they treat each other, what their values are." His words carried an unmistakable weight, and several of the town's leading citizens exchanged uncomfortable glances. The behavior they'd witnessed at the wedding had not shown their community in the best light. Sarah, overhearing the conversation, approached with Thomas at her side. "Mr. Morrison, Jim. I still don't understand why you would do such a kindness for someone you'd never met." Jim's expression grew serious, and for a moment the jovial mask slipped to reveal deep pain beneath. 5 years ago, my daughter Elizabeth was to be married in San Francisco. She was different from other young ladies of society. She cared more about books than balls, preferred helping at the orphanage to shopping for gowns. Her fiancé was a good man, a doctor who loved her for her kind heart. He paused, his hands clasping and unclasping. But the society ladies made her life miserable. They criticized everything about her dress, her hair, her interests, her choice of husband. They said she wasn't suitable for polite society, that she was an embarrassment to her family's position. Sarah's hand went to her throat, understanding beginning to dawn. The night before her wedding, she took her own life rather than face another day of their cruelty. Jim's voice was barely above a whisper. She left a note saying she couldn't bear to be the subject of ridicule anymore, that she wasn't strong enough to endure a lifetime of being judged unworthy. The room had grown completely silent. Even Mrs. Pemberton looked stricken. So when I saw what was happening here today, when I watched good people try to humiliate a young woman for having less money than they did, Jim's voice grew stronger. I couldn't let it pass. Elizabeth would have wanted me to step in. She would have loved the chance to help another bride feel beautiful and worthy. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry for your loss, and I'm honored. So honored, too. Wear her dress." "She would have liked you," Jim said with the first genuine smile he'd shown all day. "You have her strength. You didn't let them break you." Thomas stepped forward. "Sir, is there anything we can do to repay this kindness?" Jim considered for a moment. "Actually, there is. I'm planning to establish a fund for young people in this area who want to pursue education or start businesses, but lack the resources. I could use someone trustworthy to help identify worthy candidates and oversee the distribution. Would you and your wife consider taking on that responsibility?" Sarah and Thomas exchanged amazed glances. You trust us with something so important?" Sarah asked. "I've seen your character tested today," Jim replied. "Both of you. You, Sarah, showed grace under pressure. And you, Thomas, showed loyalty and love without condition. Those are the qualities I want managing Elizabeth's legacy." Bill Pemberton cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Morrison, I hope you won't judge our entire community based on the unfortunate behavior of a few individuals today. Jin's gaze was steady and unflinching. Mr. Pemberton, a community's character is revealed in how it treats its most vulnerable members. Today I saw cruelty from those who should have shown leadership, and dignity from those who had every reason to respond with bitterness. He turned to address the entire room. I came here to evaluate whether Copper Creek deserved expanded rail service, increased mining investment, and the prosperity that comes with them. After today, I'm convinced it does, but primarily because of people like the Brennans and others, who showed kindness and respect rather than those who chose to display their wealth as a weapon of exclusion. Mrs. Pemberton's face had gone pale. The implications of Morrison's words were clear. The town's economic future might well depend on how they chose to treat each other going forward. As the reception wound down, Jim prepared to take his leave. He had rooms waiting at the Territorial, capital, and business to attend to, but he made sure to speak privately with Sarah and Thomas one final time. "The dress is yours to keep, of course," he told Sarah. "But more than that, I hope you'll remember that true worth comes from character, not possessions. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." "We won't," Sarah promised. "And we'll make sure Elizabeth's memory is honored through the fund you're establishing." As Jin's carriage pulled away from the church, raising dust in the late afternoon sun, Sarah stood with her new husband watching their benefactor disappear down the dusty main street. The diamond dress caught the golden light, but more importantly, Sarah's confidence seemed permanently restored. "Do you think they'll treat people differently now?" she asked Thomas, thinking of Mrs. Pemberton and the others who had been so quick. "To judge, some will," Thomas replied, wrapping his arm around her waist. "And those who don't, well, they'll have to answer to us when someone needs defending." Sarah smiled, thinking of the education fund they would oversee, the young people they would help, and the legacy of kindness that would grow from one terrible day, transformed by unexpected grace. The sun set over Copper Creek that evening with the town subtly but permanently changed. Word of the day's events spread quickly, and with it came a new understanding that prosperity meant nothing without compassion, and that true community was built on lifting each other up rather than tearing each other down. For Sarah and Thomas, their wedding day had become something far more significant than they had ever imagined, not just the beginning of their marriage, but the start of a mission to ensure that no one in their community would face alone the kind of cruelty they had witnessed and overcome.